Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
There is a sequence, often attributed to a Scottish writer named Alexander Tytler. It describes the life cycle of a free people. It runs like this. A nation begins in bondage, in subjugation, to a monarch, a despot, a system of feudal lords or masters. And from bondage, it moves to spiritual faith. From spiritual faith to great courage. From courage to liberty. From liberty to abundance. But from abundance, it leads to complacency. And from complacency to apathy. From apathy to dependence. And from dependence, the sequence comes full circle back to bondage. A circle. Bondage to faith, to courage, to liberty, to abundance. And then the long descent through complacency and apathy and dependence back to where it began. To note, the attribution to Tytler is contested. The sequence does not appear in his verified writings, and honest people have spent considerable effort trying to find out where it actually came from. So we will not take it on faith that the insight is his and his alone. We will not present it as prophecy. We will hold it the way we hold every claim on this program, as something to be examined against the evidence and kept only if it earns its keep. But here's why I open with it today. This sequence, whoever wrote it, is the reason consequential actions exist. We study the road behind us, not to assign blame, not to despair, but because a people who can see the pattern they are living inside is a people who can choose to break it. The circle is only a circle if no one notices the turning. So the question on this final episode of Empire Liberty Ask is simple. And it is the question the whole series has been building toward. Where on that cycle does the American Republic now stand? And is the next turn inevitable? Or is it a choice? I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode number 20, the final episode of the series Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars. Today, Republic or Empire? Where do we go from here? This episode corresponds to Article 20 of the written series, which we published online Sunday, May 17th, and in book form for the 2026 Libertarian National Convention. You will have noticed a gap between the publication and this recording. So let me explain my absence. For the past few weeks, I've been on the road. First at the aforementioned Libertarian National Convention in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and then traveling across a good portion of this country on the proverbial Great American Road Trip, seeing again firsthand both the hope and the challenge of the American moment. I want to tell you what I came back with because it shapes everything that follows. I came back more optimistic, not less. Across thousands of miles and a great many conversations, what I encountered in the American people was decency, kindness, a practical generosity that does not appear on cable news and does not survive translation into a campaign advertisement. The people of this country are, in the main, good. That is not a sentimental observation. It is the load-bearing fact of this entire episode. And I will get into the why and the how before we close today. The challenge is not the people. The challenge has been what has been built above them and what they have not yet been given the tools to see clearly. Our political leaders have, at times, led us badly astray. And over 20 articles and 40 individual Part A and Part B episodes, we have documented exactly how. But the failure has been structural, not personal. Hold on to that distinction. We will return to it because it is the difference between despair and work that can be done. Also, real quickly, a logistical note. This is the conclusion of Empire of Liberty, and there will be no Tuesday Contemporary application episode following it. Instead, tomorrow, Sunday, June 7th, our next series, Self-Evident, The Road to 1776, begins. As always, this episode is designed to expand on the written article, to add primary sources, and to address what the page cannot. But it was also designed to do something the other 19 episodes were not. It is designed to stand alone. If you have found this program for the first time today, and you only have time or capacity for one episode, this is the one. This is the one to take in its entirety. Everything I assert here, everything we have documented elsewhere in detail. And I can point you to those as we go along, so you may inquire at a future time about those episodes, those articles, and those details. But for now, let us begin. If the cycle of democracy is a claim to be tested, then the test itself is the historical record. And the record of American foreign policy across the last 2 centuries is, I will argue, the cycle turning in real time, not as a metaphor, but as a documented fact. Let me state the central finding of this series at the outset, because it is the thing most often gotten wrong. The empire we inhabit was not built in a day. It was not built in 1945. It was not built in 1898. It was built across roughly 2 centuries in stages, each of which was contested at the time, each of which produced critics who saw clearly what was happening, and each of which the American political establishment proceeded to ratify and extend nonetheless. That is the shape of a cycle, not a single catastrophe, but an accumulation. Let me trace it through the 9 turns. The first turn is the Founders' Republic. The men who wrote the Constitution had read their classics, and they knew what kills republics. John Adams devoted hundreds of pages to comparing the Roman, the Greek, and Italian republics in an effort to identify what had killed each one. They concluded that the principal causes of republican death were standing armies, executive aggrandizement, foreign entanglement, and unsustainable debt. And they designed the Constitution specifically against those failure modes. Washington, in his farewell address, warned against permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Jefferson, in his first inaugural of 1801, gave us the phrase that has anchored this entire series: peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. And Madison gave us the warning that is run beneath every episode. Listen to it carefully. Of all the enemies to the public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. This was not pacifism. The early republic fought the Barbary Wars when American commerce was directly attacked. limited, congressionally authorized, concluded without occupation. That was the model. Armed neutrality, commercial engagement, constitutional restraint. On the cycle, this is courage giving way to liberty. This is the top of the wheel. The second turn is the Continental expansion. The cracks appeared within a decade. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 established the executive flexibility in foreign affairs could exceed strict constitutional warrant when the opportunity was good enough. The Indian Wars established the practice of dispossession, conquest, removal, treaty violation, and these would later be exported abroad. But the decisive moment came in 1846. President James Polk ordered American troops into territory disputed with Mexico. And when fighting resulted, Polk announced that American blood had been shed on American soil. A young congressman named Abraham Lincoln demanded that Polk identify the precise spot where it happened and prove it was American soil. Polk never answered. The war proceeded. Mexico lost roughly half of its territory. Lincoln's dissent was treated as unpatriotic. That sequence, executive provocation, a manufactured pretext, congressional acquiescence under pressure, critics marginalized as disloyal, and results ratified after the fact, is what I have called the Polk Playbook. Let's hold on to that because we're going to watch it run again and again. In 1898 with the Maine. In 1917 with the Lusitania. In 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin. In 2003 with weapons of mass destruction. And in 2026 with Venezuela and Iran. The playbook is the mechanism of the cycle. And we covered it fully in episode 2. The third term is the move to oversea empire. The Spanish-American War of 1898 turned continental expansion into overseas colonial power. The pretext was the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, immediately blamed on Spanish sabotage. Many decades later, in 1976, a Navy reassessment concluded the explosion was almost certainly an internal accident. But of course, back then, it did not matter. Spain had lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. And the Philippine-American War that followed killed roughly 200,000 Filipinos in a conflict largely erased from American memory. Theodore Roosevelt then transformed the Monroe Doctrine. Originally, the Monroe Doctrine served as a shield, a warning to European powers to stay out of the hemisphere. Roosevelt transformed it into a sword, claiming American international police power. And the most decorated Marine of his era, Major General Smedley Butler, told us in plain language what the police power meant in practice. We quoted him at length in episode 19. He said he helped make the half dozen Central American republics safe for Wall Street, and that he had been, in his words, a racketeer for capitalism. He was not a polemist. He was a senior officer testifying to what he had personally done across 33 years. The First World War completed this term. Wilson, having campaigned on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," led the country into Europe and produced the Versailles Settlement that seeded the Second World War, the Espionage and Sedition Acts, and the Palmer raids at home. The old right of the 1930s drew the lesson explicitly. The Republic was becoming an empire, and the empire would consume the Republic if it was not arrested. And the fourth term is the permanent architecture. The Second World War is the inflection most Americans are least prepared to evaluate critically, because the war was, in moral terms, defensible. The Axis was a genuine threat. But what the war produced was something new. For the first time in American history, we did not demobilize. After every prior war, the standing army shrank and the emergency powers lapsed. After 1945, neither happened. The National Security Act of 1947 created the CIA, the National Security Council, and the Department of Defense, a permanent peacetime national security apparatus operating on a track parallel to the constitutional separation of powers. The Truman Doctrine declared American interest global. NATO, in 1949, created the first permanent peacetime alliance in American history. Precisely the entangling alliance Washington and Jefferson had warned against by name. We documented this in episodes 7 and 8. On this cycle, this is abundance hardening into the structures that complacency will inhabit. The fifth term is the covert empire. The CIA, created ostensibly for intelligence, became operational fast. In 1953, Operation Ajax overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, and installed the Shah. The agency would not admit its role until 2013, but that was the template, and we built episode 9 around it. Then it repeated in 1954, a coup for the United Fruit Company, followed by a civil war that killed roughly 200,000 people. Indonesia, Cuba, the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, where the second alleged attack, the one Congress used to authorize a decade of war in Vietnam, had not actually occurred, as Robert McNamara himself later acknowledged. Chile in 1973, where a democratically elected government was overthrown on the 11th of September and replaced by 17 years of Pinochet. The constitutional consequence was an executive branch unaccountable in foreign affairs. The Church Committee documented the abuses in the mid-1970s. The reforms that followed were real, but limited, and would largely be undone after 2001. The sixth term is blowback. The word was coined inside the CIA to describe the unintended consequences of covert operations. Chalmers Johnson made it the title of his 2000 book, which predicted 1 year before September 11th, a terrorist strike on American soil by people motivated by American intervention in their countries. The 1980s set the conditions. The United States armed the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviets, financing and equipping a generation of jihadi fighters, including a wealthy Saudi recruit named Osama bin Laden. The 1991 Gulf War stationed American troops permanently in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden's stated grievance. The sanctions on Iraq through the 1990s killed, by some estimates, 500,000 children. Asked on national television whether the price was worth it, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright answered that she thought it was. Bin Laden quoted her. September 11th was blowback in the precise sense Johnson had predicted. The 60-word authorization Congress passed 3 days later has since been stretched to justify operations in 14 countries. And we trace this whole chain in episode 12. The seventh term is the forever wars. The cumulative scale is the point. Afghanistan, 20 years, ending with the Taliban back in Kabul at a cost exceeding $2 trillion. Iraq, invaded in 2003 on the predicate that did not exist. The Islamic State emerging from the wreckage. Libya in 2011. We came, we saw, he died. in a country that has not had a unified government since, with slave markets reappearing by 2017. The Brown University Cost of War Project estimates the direct and indirect death toll of the post 9/11 wars at approximately 4.5 million human beings, with some 38 million displaced, at a cost to the Treasury of roughly $8 trillion. In every case, the constitutional process was bypassed. In every case, the objectives went unachieved. In every case, the architects faced no consequences. Episode 15 and 16 carry this fully in detail. The eighth term is the Realists vindicated and ignored. George Kennan warned in 1997 that NATO expansion would be the most fateful error of the entire post-Cold War era, that it would inflame Russian nationalism and create the condition for the very war it claimed to prevent. John Mearsheimer predicted the Ukraine catastrophe in 2014 and was called an apologist. The 2022 invasion vindicated him with the precision of a clock. Mearsheimer and Walt argued in 2007 that American policy toward Israel was driven by domestic pressure rather than strategic interest and was producing radicalization. They were dismissed, and then the events of October 2023 and after demonstrated the cost they had named. In each case, the prediction was precise and public. In each case, it was dismissed. And in each case, it came to be vindicated. But in no case did the people who were wrong face any institutional consequence at all. They remain today the principal commentators on cable news and the principal advisors to both parties. Episodes 14 and 17 are on the record describing this. The ninth turn is Empire in Real Time, which brings us to the present, and to the reason this is not history, but news. The national debt stands at approximately $39 trillion, growing at roughly $7.5 billion per day. Interest payments now exceed the entire Department of Defense budget. And in January of this year, Operation Absolute Resolve removed the sitting president of Venezuela from his residence, flew him to New York, and installed his vice president, who entered into oil arrangements with the United States within weeks. The Senate voted to require authorization for further action on January 8th and reversed itself 6 days later under White House pressure. American airstrikes continue in Somalia at a record of 2 to 3 per week. Naval vessels have struck small boats in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, killing more than 160 people with no judicial process whatsoever. We documented the monetary architecture in episode 18 and the Venezuela operation in episode 19. So look at the shape of it. Courage and liberty at the founding. Abundance through the 19th century. Then complacency. The failure to demobilize. The permanent apparatus. Then apathy. The covert wars the public never examined. Then dependence. An entire economy and political class organized around the requirements of empire, sustained by debt our grandchildren have not yet been born to inherit. Each stage was contested at the time. Each produced critics who saw it clearly. Each was ratified anyway. Which means, and this is the hinge of the episode, each stage could have been resisted. And the next stage, whichever it turns out to be, can be resisted as well. The cycle is real, but a cycle is not a sentence. It is a description of what happens when a free people stops paying attention. It can be interrupted by a free people who start. Before I make the case for the path forward, I feel I am obligated to do something this program does in every episode, and that the foreign policy establishment almost never does in return. I am obligated to state the strongest argument against my own position in its strongest form, and to engage it seriously rather than dismiss it. This is this serious argument for the imperial architecture, Steelmanning, if you will, their position. It is not made by fools. It is made by Robert Kagan, by Robert Kaplan, and by the most thoughtful figures in the liberal internationalist and neoconservative traditions. And it goes like this. The 80 years from 1945 to 2025 constitute the largest, longest period of great power peace in the modern era. There has been no war between major powers, no third world war, nothing on the scale of the two that defined the first half of the 20th century. That absence is the single most important fact about the post-war international order, and is causally attributable, the argument holds, to the American military presence and American security guarantees. The forward deployment in Europe and Asia, the alliance commitments, the willingness to underwrite the system, these are what suppressed the great power conflict that would otherwise have returned. Abandon that architecture, and you risk restoring the world of 1914 and 1939. I want to be fair to this argument because it has real force. The 80 years of great power peace are real. American military presence has been a feature of those 80 years. The correlation is genuine. Anyone who waves this away has not understood it. But the causation is overstated, and it is overstated in three specific respects. First, the great power peace has been maintained substantially by nuclear deterrence, not by American conventional intervention. The reason the United States and the Soviet Union never fought a direct war was the mutual capacity for annihilation, mutually assured destruction. Not the division stationed in West Germany. The reason the United States and China have not fought is the same. The load-bearing element of the long peace is the nuclear deterrent. The conventional empire, the bases, the interventions, the proxy wars, all of that rides on top of it, and in some respects takes credit for it. Second, the post-1945 era has not been actually peaceful. It has been peaceful only for the great powers, and only if you define peace to exclude every war American actually fought. Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Ukraine by proxy, or in Iran. The casualties of those wars run into the millions. They are real, even though they were not great power wars. To call this era a period of peace is to count only the deaths that did not happen and to ignore the ones that did. Third, and this is the part of the argument that cannot survive, the architecture is no longer producing the outcomes its defenders claim for it. The Ukraine war has restored direct major power conflict to Europe. The Israel-Iran war of early 2026 has been demonstrating regional wars escalating to the very threshold of great power confrontation. Russia and China are now in substantive strategic alignment for the first time since Nixon went to Beijing in 1972. The system is, by any honest assessment, breaking down. Whatever credit the Pax Americana can claim for peace from 1945 to roughly 2014, it cannot claim continued production of that peace going forward. It is now generating the very breakdown its defenders insist only its continuation can prevent. So the Kagan argument is not without merit. I will not pretend otherwise. But it cannot bear the weight the interventionist position needs to carry. The peace was real, but partial. The American role was real, but overstated. And the system is no longer delivering the goods it once did. The case for restraint is not the claim that the Pax Americana never worked. It is the claim that it has done what it can do, has imposed costs that cannot be sustained, and is now producing collapse rather than order. In the language of the Tytler cycle, the interventionist is telling you the abundance is permanent and the architecture is what sustains it. The evidence, however, says the abundance was spent. $39 trillion in debt. And the architecture is now part of the descent. All right, let's get a little bit more positive, because here's where the episode does its real work. If the cycle is real, and if it can be interrupted, then the question is how. The path of restoration, I argue, has 4 pillars. The order matters, so I'm going to give it to you in order. The first pillar is foundational, restoring the relationship between citizens and their representatives. Everything else depends on it. Without it, the other 3 are paper and bloviating. The facts describe the present pathology with brutal economy. Congressional approval has hovered in the teens for 2 decades, somewhere around 18 to 20%, with disapproval consistently above 70%. And yet, congressional reelection rates remain above 90% in most cycles. In 2024, House incumbents seeking reelection won at a rate nearly 96%. Sit with that contradiction. Citizens do not approve of Congress, and Congress does not fear the citizens. The relationship the founders designed, representatives accountable to their constituents informed and engaged with their representatives, has broken in both directions and at once. What was done to that relationship is well documented. Gerrymandering has produced safe districts where the only real threat to a member comes from their party's own flank. So they answer to the marginal primary voter, not the median constituent. Campaign finance has made challenging an incumbent prohibitively expensive, filtering candidates by donor access rather than by connection to the people they would represent. The committee and seniority system rewards loyalty to leadership and the donor class over service to constituents. The revolving door between Congress, senior staff, and lobbying firms whose clients they regulated has produced a permanent governing class. And foreign policy votes in particular, authorizations, defense bills, war powers resolutions, are the votes least covered by local press, least asked about at town halls, and least remembered at the next election. A member can vote however their leadership tells them to vote on war and face no direct consequence from their constituents. That contradiction is one of the principal causes of the constitutional erosion this whole series has traced. These are real. They are difficult to reform. They cannot be wished away. But they are not the whole story. And here's the part no reform of gerrymandering or campaign finance will touch. The part that depends on what citizens themselves bring. Voting is not pulling a lever. Voting is the conclusion of a process that begins with becoming informed. Madison's Federalist Number 10 assumes citizens deliberate before they vote. The public discussion shapes outcomes, that the quality of self-government is a function of the quality of public attention. A republic of unengaged citizens is not a republic. It is a clientele that periodically ratifies whichever patron offers the better immediate returns. There are two failure modes on the citizen side, and they require two different remedies. The first is apathy. Citizens who do not vote, do not attend, treat politics as a spectator sport. Apathy is overcome by attention, by the recognition that how the Republic uses its power, including its war power, is the most consequential question a citizen can address, and that abdicating is choosing the empire by default. The second is ignorance. And in our era, it is the harder of the two. A century ago, ignorance was a problem of access. You could not get the information. Today, information is unlimited, instantaneous, and for all intents and purposes, free. What has changed is that the environment now contains an unprecedented capacity for falsification and propaganda. State actors run influence operations. Domestic operations run influence operations. Platforms reward engagement over accuracy. The citizen who consumes information uncritically, even from sources that present themselves as neutral, is being shaped by interests they cannot identify. The remedy is vigilance. Reagan, speaking about verifying Soviet arms control, borrowed a Russian proverb: trust but verify. He applied it to nuclear weapons, but it applies at least equal force to how we consume information now. Find the outlets and the people who have earned trust over time. Read their work, but then check the original sources they cite. Read the dissenting view and engage it on its strongest ground. Recognize that even honest analysts get things wrong, and that dishonest ones will exploit any willingness to take a claim at face value. Build a media diet that includes voices you disagree with, because the disagreement itself is information about what is genuinely contested. The libertarian tradition is well suited to this kind of vigilance precisely because it has always had to operate against the consensus. Antiwar.com in its third decade, the Libertarian Institute, the Mises Institute, Reason, Scott Horton's reporting, these are not infallible, and they have their own biases, but they are checkable. They cite their sources, and they have demonstrated track records on exactly the questions that matter for foreign policy. The second and third pillars should proceed in parallel. Restoring the war power and restoring the power of the purse. These are reciprocal. The war power without budgetary authority is performative. The budgetary authority without the war power is incomplete. Restoring the war power means repealing the open-ended authorizations. The 2001 AUMF, 60 words written for a war that no longer exists in any recognizable form, now stretched across 14 countries, and the 2002 Iraq authorization, still on the books. It means strengthening the war powers resolution rather than treating it as a suggestion. It means Congress reclaiming the decision the Constitution assigned to it and to no one else, whether the United States goes to war. Restoring the power of the purse means returning the regular order appropriations, requiring the Pentagon to pass an audit as a condition of authorization. It has never passed a clean one. Imposing sunset provisions on defense programs and restricting emergency supplementals to genuine emergencies rather than to ongoing wars dressed in supplemental clothing. The financial corollary makes the urgency plain. $39 trillion in debt. Interest payments now exceeding the entire defense budget. Defense spending itself approaching $900 billion and projected past $1 trillion within the decade. None of this is technically difficult. All of it requires the institutional courage that the first pillar makes possible. If your congressman does not view it this way, vote the bum out. The fourth pillar settles the past, restoring accountability. The first three pillars prevent future damage. This one addresses the damage already done. Because a republic that imposes no cost on those who lied to it, those who brought it into wars of choice unnecessarily, oversaw discredited intelligence, and profited from failed interventions, is a republic that has yet decided to take itself seriously. The accountability gap is structural. The architects of the Iraq War, the people who promoted the false intelligence, who promised the war would last weeks, who said American forces would be greeted as liberators, face no professional consequences for having been catastrophically wrong. They write op-eds, they appear on cable news, they sit on corporate boards and run think tanks and serve in subsequent administrations. The same pattern repeats with the officials who were wrong about the Afghan stability, who were wrong about the Russian timeline, wrong about what an air campaign would do to the Iranian nuclear program. Their predictions are forgotten. Their next analysis are treated as authoritative. Accountability requires that the architects of failure be named and held to public account in the institutions they still inhabit. It requires that the revolving door be made transparent with real disclosure and real cooling off periods. It requires that foreign-funded think tanks are disclosed clearly and that their analysis identified as paid advocates rather than independent experts when they testify and when they appear in news. It requires that the intelligence community's actual track record be part of the public record when current officials are quoted. And it requires that we name, map, and make visible the structure Eisenhower warned about in his farewell address. His famous phrase was the military-industrial complex. His original draft, at least decades later, used a broader phrase, the military-industrial congressional complex. Both describe a structure that has expanded, not contracted, since 1961. These four pillars are not utopian. None of them requires a political class we do not have. They are specific points where attention and engagement re-enter the system and bend it. The founder's own instruments still lying within reach. But notice that every one of them runs back through the first pillar. A Congress that does not believe its constituents are watching will not reclaim the war power, will not reclaim the purse, will not hold anyone accountable. The instrument of the Founders' Republic was a Congress that feared the people who sent it. Restoring that, the fear and the trust on the other side of it, is the precondition for everything else. Now let us go back to where we began and what I came home from the road believing. Return to the cycle of democracy: bondage, faith, courage, liberty, abundance, complacency, apathy, dependence, and back to bondage. I asked at the start where the American Republic stands on that wheel. The honest answer, after 40 episodes, is this: the abundance has been spent. Complacency and apathy are well advanced. Dependence is visible in the debt, in the permanent apparatus, in a political class and an economy organized around the requirements of empire. We are far around the wheel. But subjugation, bondage, has not arrived, and it is not inevitable. I want to tell you precisely why I believe that, and it has everything to do with the quotation we just examined 2 episodes ago. Lord Acton, John Emmerich Edward Dalbarg Acton, the English Catholic historian, wrote a letter in 1887 to Bishop Mandel Crichton. Almost every American has heard the first sentence, and almost none have heard the second. Here's the full passage. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men. Even when they exercise influence and not authority, still more when you superadd the tendency or the certainty of corruption by authority. Listen to what Acton is actually saying. Great men are almost always bad men. Not because they began bad, but because they hold authority. And authority corrupts. The corruption is not a personal failing. The corruption is structural. The office corrupts the man. The man does not corrupt the office. This is the basic predicate of everything, and is why I came back from the road more hopeful, not less. Because if the problem were the character of the American people, recovery would be hopeless. If what I'd found across thousands of miles were cruelty and indifference, then no reform could save us. And the cycle would simply be human nature playing out. That's not what I found. That's not what you found. That's not what you know. What you know is what I found too. It's decency. It's kindness. It's a people far better than the policy enacted in their name. The corruption we have documented across these 40 episodes is not in those people. It is in the apparatus that has accumulated above them. The unchecked, the unaudited, unaccountable concentration of authority that Acton warned was corrupting by its nature, no matter who staffs it. The Democrat who criticizes one president's overreach deploys the same powers when handed them. The Republican who criticizes the others does the same. The corruption is the apparatus, not the personnel. That was the lesson of episode 19, and is the key that unlocks this one. Because here's what follows. If the danger were the people's character, we could do nothing. But the danger is structural, and structures can be changed. Acton's peril is also Acton's instruction. He told us where the corruption comes from, accumulated, unchecked authority, which tells us exactly where the remedy lies. Limit the power, and you limit the corruption. The founders heard this a full century before Acton said it. The Constitution they wrote was the Acton insight applied in advance. Separation of powers. The war power lodged in Congress, the purse lodged in the House. The whole structure designed to keep authority dispersed so that it could not corrupt absolutely. The 4 pillars I just described are nothing more than the recovery of that structural limit. This is why the cycle is not a sentence. The sequence often attributed to Tytler describes what happens when a free people stops enforcing the limits on power. It is a description of neglect, not a law of physics. It turns because attention lapses. It can be stopped when attention returns. Consider the Roman example that has shadowed this entire series. Rome did not fall to invasion. No foreign army dictated the end of the Republic. It was abandoned in stages, each stage seeming individually tolerable by citizens who had gradually concluded, often without ever consciously choosing, that the Republic was worth less than what the strong man offered. Cicero saw it clearly, named it from the Senate floor, and was killed for trying to stop it. But the deeper failure was not his death. It was that by the time he spoke, most Romans had stopped listening. The Senate did not lose its power to constrain Caesar. it lost the citizens who would have stood behind a Senate willing to use it. The American Republic is not at the Rubicon. It is somewhere on the long trajectory before it. The institutional checks have been weakened, but they have not been destroyed. Congress can still vote. Elections still occur. The Constitution still binds, however attenuated its grip. We saw the proof in real time this past January when 52 senators voted to assert the war power over Venezuela. And then 6 days later, 51 voted to block the same resolution after the White House applied pressure. Both votes were cast by representatives accountable to constituents. Both are reversible at the next election by constituents who care. The capacity is still present. Only the will is fragile, and the will is the one thing citizens can supply. So this is the choice, and it's not abstract. The decision between republic and empire is not made once by elites in a single dramatic moment. It is made continuously by citizens at every election, in every primary, on every vote, in every refusal to accept the president has the authority as the final word on whether a war is constitutional. Empire persists because too few demand its end. And the reverse is exactly true as well. Empire ends when enough demand it ends, and not one moment before. None of us, and I mean this as plainly as I can say this, none of us want our children or our grandchildren to live in the final stages of that cycle. None of us want to hand them a return to subjugation and bondage as their inheritance. That's not a partisan fear. It is the thing that good people I met on the road would understand instantly if it were put to them clearly. The work of this program has always been to put it to all of us clearly. "20 articles and 40 episodes have traced what was done to an inheritance. They have shown how a republic that began with a warning against entangling alliances became an empire of some 750 bases, perpetual war, and a constitutional erosion that the founders specifically designed against. That is the record, and we did not soften it. But the record is not the verdict. The cycle of democracy turns only when a free people let it turn. Through complacency, through apathy, through the dependence that follows when citizens stop watching. It is interrupted by attention. It is broken by the citizen who becomes informed, who verifies, who engages, who treats the use of the nation's power as their own responsibility and not someone else's job. The founders did not bequeath us a fate we are powerless to change. They bequeathed us a constitution that, even now, hands us the instruments of recovery. Whether we pick them up is the only open question. A word for whoever is hearing this, including those who may find it months or years from now with no memory of when it first aired. This episode was built to stand on its own, but it stands on a great deal of work. And that work is there for whenever you want to go deeper. Before Empire of Liberty, this project produced several earlier series. And these remain available in full on our Substack pages and at consequentialactions.com. From general welfare to the Great Society traced how the domestic state expanded beyond its constitutional bounds. The New Leviathan examined the modern administrative and security state. Together with this series, they asked a single question across every installment. How much power should government wield? And what happens when it exceeds its proper bounds? If anything in this episode has prompted you to look further, those series are where the evidence lives. And this is what comes next. Tomorrow, Sunday, the 7th of June, 2026, we begin a new series, Self-Evident, The Road to 1776. It is not a sequel to Empire of Liberty. It is the ground that the Empire of Liberty stands on. This series showed what happens when the inheritance is squandered. Self-Evident will show what the inheritance actually is, tracing the lineage of American liberty from the classical Mediterranean, where Cicero's voice still carries through the long centuries of human thought that produced the truths the Declaration called self-evident. Because to defend our rights, we have to first understand where they came from. And so this is the work ahead. Republic or empire? The founders gave their answer. The cycle is real, but it is not a sentence. And the choice now is ours. Where do we go from here? I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 20 of Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you'll find all written articles, as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause and the New Leviathan. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes, and follow me on X at @JKellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.